The John Pirie was the first ship that left England to set up the colony of South Australia. It was only 19 metres long, and that's shorter than a cricket pitch.
It had 28 passengers, plus crew, plus supplies, plus farm animals, all crammed together for a 5-month voyage. Their tiny ship was slower than ships that left after them. One passenger described their arrival thus.
We were very glad of the run ashore and to fraternise with those who had already arrived and who gave us hearty cheers of welcome. They never thought we would arrive, as we were in a washing tub steered with a tiller.
G'day, I'm Peter.
And g'day, I'm Greg.
Welcome to Today's Stories from Our Past, a podcast about a history of Australia from about 1800 onwards. The story is told through the experiences of those who lived it.
We'll tell you stories about Australia that you probably haven't heard before.
This is the third episode in a season that we've called Bound for South Australia. If you haven't listened to this from episode 1, we'd suggest you stop listening now and go back to the beginning.
So what do we discuss in this episode?
With everything in place, it's time to send the eager immigrants, surveyors, bureaucrats and company officials out to South Australia.
So how did they do that?
Just a quick recap. In episode 1, we talked about Edward Gibbon Wakefield and his notion of systematic colonisation, and how he and Robert Goodger got the concept over the line with the new convict-free colony to be set up in South Australia. Then in the last episode, we suggested a timeline for events to occur. Given that the whole scheme was based on the pre-sale of land, I would have thought that it would have not been unreasonable for the new colonists to have land available for selection and occupation as soon as they arrived. After all, they'd already paid for it. This should have also suited the profit ambitions of the South Australian Company. It would also mean that farmers could start planting crops and vegetables as soon as possible, so the colony could become self-sufficient. So my sensible plan would be: Step 1, appoint all of the important people: Governor, Colonial Secretary, Surveyor-General, Resident Commissioner, etc. Step 2, send the Surveyor-General and his team out first to select the site of the proposed capital and the best location for the agricultural land. Then survey the city and the country blocks of land to be ready for sale and occupation. Step 3, send out the government officials to set up a bureaucracy and establish law and order, and send the commission people out at the same time, as they had parallel authority to the governor in some areas. And finally, step 4, send out the eager immigrants. They could immediately find their block of land to get themselves settled and start their business or production of food to make the colony self-sufficient. In that way, there would be a first fleet leaving England for South Australia, but with a staggered departure schedule, with surveyors going first and immigrants last.
Oh, okay, that sounds like a plan.
So, in the last episode, we discussed the employment of various people who would go to South Australia. They included John, better known as Bluff Jack, Hindmarsh, age 51, an old Navy stalwart. He was appointed governor of the new colony. Thus, he represented the Crown. James Hurdle Fisher, age 46, he was appointed resident commissioner. He represented the South Australian Commission, a parallel authority essentially responsible for land sales. Colonel William Light, aged 50, was appointed Surveyor-General, with George Strickland Kingston, aged just 29, as his Deputy Surveyor-General. And, amongst others, my great-great-great-grandfather, William Henry Neal, aged 36, as an Assistant Surveyor, even though he didn't know the first thing about surveying. Then there's Robert Goodger, aged 33, who had been appointed Colonial Secretary, and my great-great-grandfather, Charles Nantes, aged just 19, who was engaged as Goodger's clerk. We also covered the South Australian Company, a commercial business that had invested heavily in the new colony and wanted to get on with making a profit out there. Out of this story came a whole suite of potential issues, personal animosities, unclear command structure, etc., that hung over all of them.
Yeah, there seems to be some issues festering here.
Yup. Now we can get on with the story of the First Fleet to South Australia.
Yeah, you suggested that there was a logical order in which the ship should have left. That is, surveyors first, government officials next, and immigrants last. Is this what actually happened?
Well, no, not at all. But to be fair, I'd forgotten about a commercial reality. By early 1836, enough land to satisfy the requirements of the Act had been sold. That's sight unseen in England. And the paid-up landholders were ready to go to South Australia. These landholders then employed the labourers they needed for their business ventures or farms in the new colony. More importantly, there was the South Australian Company, who by then had heavily invested in the venture. The company wanted to get on with implementing the business plan that we discussed in the previous episode. So the company decided to send out 4 ships as soon as possible. At this time, nobody knew where the capital city of the new colony would be, even though they knew it would be called Adelaide. It was Colonel Light's job to find a suitable site. So, without their final destination known, it had been agreed that all ships in the staggered First Fleet should initially go to Nepean Bay at the eastern end of KI. The schooner, the John Pirie, was chartered by the South Australian Company, and it was the first to depart on 22 February 1836. The John Pirie set sail only 3 days after the letters patent setting up the colony was signed. This ship was the smallest of the 9 ships in the First Fleet. It was only 19 metres long. That's shorter than a cricket pitch. And she had 21 or 24 or 28 passengers on board, depending on what you read. Just a digression here. The number of people listed on board a ship to South Australia in these episodes is often repeated differently, as we have just noted with the John Pirie. It can be quite irritating. For example, passengers aren't necessarily the only people on board. There's also the crew, who most often are not counted as passengers. Then there's children, who are not always counted as passengers. Sometimes only fee-paying passengers are counted, and sometimes the number given is the number of immigrants intending to stay only. Unfortunately, there can also be a difference between the number of people who boarded a ship and the number of people that disembarked at their final destination. Sometimes people disembark somewhere along the way. Other times, this difference is the number of people who died during the voyage. And finally, sometimes there's just poor record keeping. So, when you access different reports about a voyage, it's not unusual to find different numbers of passengers listed in different sources. So, back to the John Pirie. In addition to the passengers, there were supplies to help them survive for a while on KI and farm animals. The voyage to KI took about 5 months.
I can't imagine what it would have been like to be on that boat. No longer than a cricket pitch, 24 passengers plus livestock for 5 months in the cold roaring 40s of the Great Southern Ocean. You'd think they'd go stir crazy. I assume that they made it to KI okay.
Yeah. One passenger, Henry Orford, travelled on the John Pirie. In August 1886, in a newspaper article celebrating his 50 years in the colony, Henry described their arrival thus.
We were very glad of the run ashore and to fraternise with those who had already arrived and who gave us hearty cheers of welcome. They never thought we would arrive, as we were in a washing tub steered with a tiller. All the vessels hoisted their bunting, and their people gave us every assistance to land. We saw some of the islanders who reminded us very much of Robinson Crusoe.
They arrived safe and sound on 16 August, but they weren't the first to do so. Next to leave London was the Duke of York, which left 2 days after the John Pirie with 42 passengers. It was also chartered by the South Australian Company and was commanded by Captain Robert Clark Morgan. It arrived at Nepean Bay on 27 July 1836, after 154 days at sea. Next to go was the Lady Mary Pelham. She left on 30 March and arrived at Nepean Bay 3 days after the Duke of York. She then sailed to Hobart Town for a fit-out for whaling. This was part of the business plan of the company. However, only a small amount of whale oil was taken during the voyages, so it was decided to convert the ship's business to trading. Lady Mary Pelham then took 2,000 bags of sugar to Sydney. On the voyage to KI, Captain Robert Ross was in charge, with most of the 29 on board being crew members who anticipated the whaling venture, when they would be paid according to their share of the catch. The only full fare-paying passengers were Cornelius Birdseye, the South Australian Company's overseer of flocks and herds, and his wife. There were also 5 assisted immigrants and South Australian Company employees working as crew members. Last of the company's ships to leave was the Emma. She left on 21 April and arrived on 5 October. She carried 22 passengers.
So these ships didn't really carry many assisted immigrants per se. There were many South Australian Company officials and employees.
Yes. They all arrived at Nepean Bay as arranged and set up camp there.
Okay, so what did they do there? The surveyors hadn't arrived yet, so they don't know where the future capital of the colony is going to be. How did they spend their time?
The South Australian Company took charge of the first landing of settlers and company officials at Reeves Point in Nepean Bay on 27 July 1836. This would become the site, later moved a bit south, for Kingscote. The settlement was named after Henry Kingscote, one of the founding directors of the South Australian Company. An early contender for the settlement's name was Angus, after the company's chairman, George Fife Angus. But this was changed by Samuel Stevens, the company's manager in charge on site.
I wonder if he got the sack for not naming the settlement after his boss.
I can't help you with that one. Anyhow, the Kingscote's arrivals raised a sapling pole and proclaimed the colony of South Australia in the name of King William IV. But the official start of government couldn't really start until the first governor, that's John Hindmarsh, arrived on the HMS Buffalo. She was the last of the 9 ships in the First Fleet to arrive. The first Kingscote settlers made contact with islanders. They were deserters from English and American whaling ships and sealers who'd arrived on the island in the early 1800s. Some of the sealers on the island drifted into the camp and taught the new arrivals how to make damper from flour and water. With the weather being miserable, the food unpalatable, and rum selling cheap on KI, some of the settlers enlivened their existence with riotous parties. Six months later, most of the 1836 KI settlers and South Australian Company officers moved to Holdfast Bay on the coast of the Adelaide Plains as chosen by Light. Holdfast Bay is modern-day Glenelg. Kingscote was dogged by the lack of water and suitable building timber, so it was abandoned by the South Australian Company 4 years later.
Hang on, I thought you said that the surveyors should have been the first to go. When did they leave?
The surveyors left next. The surveyors were to go together in 2 ships, the Rapid and the Cygnet, but Light, who was the commander of the Rapid, he was ill, and thus its departure was delayed. In the end, the main survey party, including Deputy Surveyor-General George Strickland Kingston, had left 6 weeks earlier than Light. They were on the Cygnet. They left on 19 March 1836, while Light departed on 1 May.
That sounds a bit messy. Anyway, do we know anything about their journeys?
Yep. As we will discover, many passengers on the voyages out to South Australia kept diaries. Presumably this helped pass the time on the long and tedious trips. Many of these diaries still exist, and they are a reliable source of factual information and juicy gossip. More on that in later episodes. Information is available on both voyages. Firstly, the Cygnet, which included my ancestor, William Henry Neal, and his family.
Well, I guess that the survival of the diaries is linked to this being the establishment of a brand new colony, one without convicts.
Yeah, I suspect that everybody knew this was going to be something new and different. So, back to the Cygnet. The Cygnet, captained by John Rolls, was chartered by the South Australian Colonization Commissioners for settlement work. It had a passenger list that included the prominent merchant John Morford and the first harbour master, Captain Thomas Lipson. As well as carrying some colonists, the Cygnet took most of the survey team. In our previous episode, we talked about some of the festering issues that came about before they left, various resentments simmering over salaries and the relative competencies of different appointments. On the long voyage, the Cygnet became the setting for considerable tension between Deputy Surveyor-General George Strickland Kingston and third in charge Assistant Surveyor Boyle Travers Finnis. The Kingston-Finnis tension stemmed from Finnis, who'd learned his survey skills as a British Army officer, applying for the Deputy Surveyor-General's position and missing out to the much less experienced Kingston. Originally, Finnis was told by Roland Hill, the Colonisation Commission Board Secretary, that it had been decided not to fill the position. A few days later, Roland Hill's personal friend, Kingston, was given the job. We covered some of this in the previous episode.
Yeah, I can see how that would have irritated Finnis.
Yeah, and conditions on board the Cygnet didn't help the Kingston-Finnis tension. The vessel was crammed with stores and the luggage of the 84, or up to 99, depending on what you read, men, women and children on board. Conditions were worse below decks, where the 61 steerage passengers lived. Fortunately, William Henry Neal and his family were cabin passengers who had more room. Down below, married couples had little or no privacy, their quarters separated from the single men's berths by just canvas screens. With not enough tables for all the passengers, many had to eat their meals sitting on their bunks while the boat was rocking backwards and forwards. Water was soon found to be stale and food inadequate. Kingston had been put in charge of personnel, but he was soon at loggerheads with the ship's captain, John Rolls. For some reason, Kingston believed that the captain should report and consult with him on the operations and movements of the vessel.
Doesn't the captain usually have sole command of the vessel?
Yes, but it seems that Kingston was on a bit of an ego trip here. Meanwhile, Finnis concentrated on discrediting his boss. In one instance, Kingston tried to stop a fight between two labourers, but he was nearly punched to the ground. Finnis confided in Thomas Gilbert, the Colonisation Commissioner's colonial storekeeper, that Kingston was less suited to command a body of men than any of those cabin passengers. Later in the voyage, Kingston strongly objected to Captain Rolls' decision to put into Rio de Janeiro to restock supplies and get some fresh water. After putting into Rio, the passengers and crew made many trips ashore and met with the ambassador and the consul general. Inevitably, they returned to the ship drunk, including Captain Rolls. A fiasco of events followed in Rio, whereby the crew, who were being bossed about by all and sundry, eventually started a mutiny, resulting in Brazilian soldiers coming aboard and arresting the mutineers.
This doesn't sound like a very harmonious trip. I do recall that Kingston was only 29 years old, and it seems he was too young for the Deputy Surveyor-General post, and he let the appointment go to his head, thus causing disharmony amongst everyone on board.
Yeah, a mutiny is not a good look on board. Kingston may have been a pain in the neck, but the captain apparently was no saint either. By all accounts, he took to the bottle when in port, and perhaps when on board, and even accidentally shot a crew member in the hand when he was loading a flintlock pistol. Eventually, by 5 July 1836, the Cygnet was at sea again. The stop at Rio hadn't been scheduled, so it delayed their expected arrival date. Eventually, after 175 days, they arrived at Nepean Bay on 11 September 1836, a month after the frustrated Colonel Light on the Rapid, even though they'd left 6 weeks before him.
So Light had been cooling his heels on KI without most of his support staff.
Yeah. Colonel Light on the Rapid had waited for a fortnight for the Cygnet to arrive. Before deciding just to get on with his job, he went off exploring around Gulf St Vincent. It was his job to find a location for the new capital.
So what happened when the Cygnet finally arrived?
Well, the first thing to do was set up camp. Drawing on his military experience, Finnis supervised setting up a camp for the surveying party on the banks of the river, which was named the Cygnet. You'll remember that there were already South Australian Company people there. Finnis became even more critical than ever of Kingston because, quote, nothing was done to forward the surveys. After all, that's why they were there. Kingston simply took to long walks across the island, searching for good arable land. He found the ground covered with dead trees about the size of mallee, felled by the fires or by hurricanes. There was no land anything like Sutherland's glowing report.
Okay, so Kingston was finding out about the fake news report that we discussed in episode 1.
Yes, he was. Now, with Kingston often absent from the settlement, Finnis effectively took command and asked that a more civilised way of life be adopted. He resorted to publicly condemning some men's actions and became engaged in violent arguments, to the extent of challenging one of the men to a duel. Dr. John Woodford, who by then had arrived with Light on the Rapid and was destined to become one of the infant colony's most respected medical practitioners, somehow managed to convince Finnis that a written apology would be acceptable.
There seems to be trouble brewing amongst the surveyors. Do we know anything about the voyage on the Rapid with Colonel Light on board?
Yes. On 1 May 1836, after a short delay due to ill health, as mentioned earlier, Light sailed with the rest of his surveying staff aboard the Rapid. Light was in command of the ship. Also on board were William and Edward Gandy and their sister Maria, who we've mentioned previously. Maria had become Light's mistress, for lack of a better word, after he separated from his second wife, Mary Bennett, but was unable to get a divorce. Also on board was Dr. John Woodford, who met Light when he worked for the Pasha of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, in the early 1830s. Woodford kept a diary. From this, the progress of the journey was recorded thus. We passed Madeira on the 15th, crossed the equator on June 8th, and performed the usual absurd ceremony, and rounded the Cape of Good Hope on July the 12th. The Rapid had been bought by the South Australian Company. Light was given the sole responsibility for finding and choosing the site of the province's capital. The Rapid had reached Nepean Bay on 22 August 1836 after a voyage of just 114 days. That's like 60 days shorter than the Cygnet. Compared to the voyage of the Cygnet, the voyage of the Rapid was very harmonious, in no small way due to Colonel Light. William Pullen, the second officer on the Rapid, wrote about the voyage 6 years later. He commented that,
"The details of a long sea voyage have been so often detailed that I shall not say anything about ours. Suffice it was a very pleasant one."
He concluded that the continuing good humour and pleasantness of the voyage was a tribute to the commander's personality, just as its fast progress was a tribute to his seamanship. Pullen described his teammates thus:
"The Colonel, a real worthy old fellow, aged 50, as ready to join in our jokes as any other. Field, a fine gentlemanly fellow now settled in the Mount Barker district. Hill, a rough, good-humoured old fellow, very much given to drinking deep. Claughton, a seaman who had been in the East India Company service, also rather addicted to grog. Dr. John Woodford, the surgeon, ill with seasickness most of the voyage. And young Jacob, hardly from home before, with simplicity beaming in his countenance."
Little time was lost upon their arrival at the new settlement at Nepean Bay on August 22. Light got on with his job, even though most of his surveying team were on the Cygnet and still not there. Light had already taken the opportunity to observe a low line of sandhills stretching away to the east as the vessel came into Nepean Bay from Encounter Bay. He's probably talking about the mouth of the Murray there. Light then rejected Encounter Bay's unsafe harbour as a possible site for a capital city. He then looked more closely at KI, where he found, surprise, surprise, poor land. The hatch boat had been hoisted out, rigged and placed under Pullen's command so that this boat could be used for inshore exploration. A hatch boat was a type of fishing boat found mostly in southern England in the 19th century. Its deck consisted of many movable hatches, for holding fish usually, but in this instance for holding surveying equipment. Light employed the boat to make various excursions around the bay. Then, on 7 September, he set off in the Rapid to start his examination of Gulf St Vincent. You'll remember that the Cygnet arrived a few days later, that's on the 11th. Light was delighted with what he found. After a careful examination of what he called Rapid Bay, he continued north to Yakanlilla, Aldina Bay, and the sandbanks off the entrance to a mangrove-lined inlet. Working with Colonel Light, boat parties managed to find a river, which eventually became Port Adelaide, but this was not investigated. The Rapid continued north in search of a better harbour, and during the return south, the hatch boat entered the previously unseen inlet to the eastern channel of Port Adelaide. The Rapid anchored off the entrance to a further south mangrove-lined inlet and successfully weathered several gales there, which led to the place being named Holdfast Bay. This is actually modern-day Glenelg. Light returned south to Rapid Bay on 11 October and was again beset by gales. Undoubtedly, this is the occasion depicted by Light in his well-known painting of the Rapid. Soon, Light decided on the Adelaide Plains as the best location for the new settlement. Settlers and company officials began to move from KI to Holdfast Bay on the Adelaide Plains coast before Light found the full entrance to the Port Adelaide River on November 21. Light's Mediterranean and Far East travels gave him the confidence to choose the site of the colony's capital. It had a small but safe harbour, that's Port Adelaide, fertile grassy adjacent plains for farming blocks, the Mount Lofty Ranges in the background for a supply of water, and a pleasant site for the town beside the Torrens River. Light had chosen the site for the new colony before first Governor Hindmarsh arrived with other settlers on the HMS Buffalo on 18 December 1836.
Okay, Light seems to have been remarkably busy, even if Kingston hadn't done much while on KI. I assume that the government officials would arrive soon?
Yes. Finally, the last three ships arrived. They carried Robert Gouger, the colonial secretary, and then finally Governor Hindmarsh. They were the Africaine, which left on 28 June 1836, HMS Buffalo, which left on 11 July, and Tam O'Shanter, which left on the 20th of July 1836. We'll talk a lot more about the voyage of the Africaine in a later episode. That ship carried my great-great-grandfather, Charles Nantes.
Okay, it seems that the departure schedule of the ships doesn't match the program that you suggested initially, though. This all seems very messy. What happened after the last ship carrying the governor arrived?
As mentioned, Governor Hindmarsh was on the HMS Buffalo, which arrived on 28 December 1836. This is now called Proclamation Day, and we'll discuss what happened on that day in a later episode.
Okay, so all the ships of the First Fleet have arrived, and we'll discuss what happened in them in later episodes. So is there anything else to discuss now?
Yes. Just 2 days after the Cygnet arrived in Nepean Bay, something significant happened. On board the Cygnet, Nepean Kingston Neal was born on 13 September 1836 to father William Henry Neal, who was then 36, and mother Mary, who was 34.
Oh, that means she was pregnant during the voyage out to South Australia.
Yeah. And everything that I've read means that it would have been an extremely uncomfortable voyage. Seasickness on top of morning sickness, poor food, rough sleeping conditions, not much fun. But for William, there was one upside. For the rest of his life, he claimed that his son was, undoubtedly, the first child born in South Australia.
Don't you mean the first immigrant child?
Yeah, but that's not the way William put it. Anyhow, the child's first name, Nepean, was in honour of Nepean Bay where he was born, and the second name was in honour of William's boss, George Strickland Kingston, who was also the child's godfather. The child was christened by the ship's captain, John Rolls, on 31 October. That's 48 days later. Unfortunately, Nepean died on 18 November and was buried at Holdfast Bay, probably somewhere in the sand dunes of Colonial Beach. This means that young Nepean was also the first English person to die in the colony of South Australia. I say it that way because there's every possibility that some whaler or sealer died on KI, but record keeping amongst that bunch was pretty much non-existent. So other Europeans had probably died in South Australia before Nepean Neal. Furthermore, Nepean was actually not the first child born amongst the colonists. Emma Barbara Green was born on 9 September 1836 on board the Cygnet, 4 days earlier than Nepean. Emma died in June 1837, so both children had short lives. Life was certainly difficult in those early days of the colony. Most of the staggered First Fleet were at sea in mid-1836. Throughout the rest of the world, these events occurred. Over in France, on 29 July 1836, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris was formally inaugurated. The Arc de Triomphe honours those who fought and died for France in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, with the names of all French victories and generals inscribed on its inner and outer surfaces. Beneath its vault lies the tomb of the unknown soldier from World War I. Then, on 1 September 1836, Narcissa Whitman became the first documented European-American woman to cross the Rocky Mountains. This may not have been all that noteworthy, but her death was. Her husband Marcus and Narcissa, along with 11 others, were killed on 29 November 1847 by a small group of Cayuse men who had accused the Whitmans of poisoning 200 Cayuse who were under their medical care during an outbreak of measles. This was an example of violence between First Nations people and settlers on the frontier.
So by now everybody had arrived except the governor. They were cooling their heels on KI waiting for him to turn up.
Well, not quite so. Colonel Light was confident that KI was not the long-term location of the settlement. He knew the location he had found on the eastern side of St Vincent's Gulf was the best location, So the surveyors and government officials who had arrived earlier moved to Holdfast Bay and set up camp there. This is modern-day Glenelg.
You mentioned earlier that your great-great-grandfather was employed by the Colonial Secretary, Robert Goodger, to be his clerk. When did they arrive?
They came out on the Africaine. But before we talk about that voyage, we need to look into the background of my ancestor, Charles Nantes. As with others, we ask the question, why did he come out to South Australia? We'll discuss that in our next episode.
Fair enough. Thanks for listening.
So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.